Welcome back. Last week, we opened one of our sessions talking about Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's suffering from mob attacks in China in response to the United States lambasting China about their activities in the South China Seas. Michael, this thing is really starting to spin out of control.
Well, this week, China went out of its way to warn Japan to not get involved in the South China Seas disputes that are happening. And it's not just one South China Sea dispute, because we had the decision by an international arbitration council in favor of the Philippines regarding its claims vis-a-vis China in the South China Sea, but we also had actions by Indonesian government officials meeting on one of their islands in the South China Sea. They had a cabinet meeting, in fact, there. So we have also today, I think, a French frigate that is trying to do a freedom of navigation operation within the South China Sea. There are all kinds of countries that are moving in and around this issue. And China went out of its way to tell Japan, stay out of this. That's a very interesting development because the two sides have been dancing around this issue, particularly because China seems to have pulled back a little bit on the Senkaku Islands. And there is not, at least in the media, maybe if you read the Fujisanke Group publications, you probably hear about it more, but in the most part, it's very quiet as compared to where it was last year.
They had an opportunity. They issued a communique where the collection of the nations in the South China Sea area were able to say, this arbitration decision you should follow. They actually pulled back a little bit on signing something that was really strongly worded, kind of letting China go with a slap on the wrist.
Well, in this case, you're talking about ASEAN. And ASEAN was trying to get together all of its members to put out some kind of statement in support of its member, the Philippines. Unfortunately, several of ASEAN's newer members, particularly Cambodia, are very much inclined to, if not in the pockets of, the Chinese government. So that what came out of the ASEAN meetings was nothing. Now, what China is also trying to do simultaneously is to keep other groups out. It would like to deal with this on a bilateral relationship basis with all of the members of ASEAN and with nobody else. But unfortunately, countries such as Japan have a vital interest in the South China Sea, particularly in the Japanese case, because so much, nearly all of Japan's oil, at some point, passes through the South China Sea.
Right.
And Japan does not have warships escorting those tankers. It's basically on an honor system. And it's not just Japan, it's South Korea, it's China. All the nations of East Asia, up until now, have been basically allowing the United States Navy to be the ultimate guarantor of the safety of the delivery of their energy supplies. That's now in question with China moving into the South China Sea and building these islands and building these airstrips and putting anti-aircraft guns on them and fighter planes and all this material that they're putting in. They are changing the equation.
Right.
And it's facetious of China to say to Japan, don't get involved.
Right.
Well, geez, what is Japan going to do? Just sit there and watch this entire region be taken over as a part of China? It's not in Japan's interest. It's not in it's contrary to Japan's security. So this is going to be clearly something that's going to have to be worked out. But there are no really mature persons in the room.
Right. Well, it's not quite one party is rattling a saber and the other party doesn't have a saber to rattle. It's not quite like that, but it is kind of. I mean, international law, everybody should follow international law. Most of the small nations, most of the companies, most of the people who are involved in commerce must follow international law. But when you get at this level, they can thumb their nose and say, look, we're not going to honor that arbitration. We're going to do whatever we want to.
The players in this particular drama are all guilty. It's an unfortunate fact. If the Chinese are looking askance at this arbitration panel's ruling, it's not really possible for Japan or the United States to say, you are a bad boy. You should join the international community in obeying. Because in the case of the United States, they are not parties to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. So what's the basis of your being so high and mighty? And Japan, which is an UNCLOS signee, when it was faced with this question of the international legality of its pelagic whaling program in the South Pacific, it's now saying, well, we don't really think that international court decision applies to us, so we're going to send out our whaling fleet, which they did.
Because they're only capturing them.
Oh, yeah, no, they're going there to kill them for scientific purposes. And yes, they reduced by 2/3 the number of whales that they killed, but they still went out and killed them, despite the fact that the ruling specifically states this is not in any way covered by the scientific, experimental, and scientific clauses inside the International Whaling Commission's own various charters. Japan has chosen, in that case, to follow the rules that it wants to follow. China can then turn around and say, we're just like you. And another aspect to this has, of course, to do with Okinoshima. The Chinese have been condemned worldwide for building islands and creating a fait accompli.
Right.
And creating a territorial area where previously there was merely submerged reefs. Japan, again, can't be very high and mighty on this because one of its most important and an extremely expensive initiatives is the building of structures on what is essentially what cannot be claimed as an island, and calling it an island, which is Okinoshima, which is uninhabitable. It's a pair of rocks surrounded by a coral reef in the middle of a vast area of ocean. Japan has claimed that is actually an island, and they have spent an extraordinary amount of money reinforcing and surrounding these two rocks with huge structures made of concrete. Oh yes, there are channels that allow the water to come every day and touch the rock and then flow away without ever eroding it in any way. And to prevent rain from eroding these things, they're covered with titanium domes.
Okay.
It's completely insane, except it does create, in the Japanese view, it does generate an economic exclusion zone, an EEZ, which Japan furiously and vigorously enforces, and in fact is currently a source of tremendous tension with the government of Taiwan, which doesn't recognize this EEZ. Again, Japan's its own escutcheon is not clean. It's not able to say to other countries, don't do this, because they're doing it.
Well, the Chinese are pouring an enormous amount of money. I don't know how much money the Tokyo government is spending on the creation of this small island, but the Chinese are really going gung-ho. They're in fact actually having cruise ships visit the island.
Yeah, and if Ishihara Shintaro had his way, there'd be cruise ships visiting Okinoshima and looking at those two little stones. And I say that not because I don't like Ishihara Shintaro, but he actually visited them. It's part, I suppose you should say this as part of the Olympics, that they are the ultimate southern point, not of Japan, but of Tokyo.
Right.
They are part of metropolitan Tokyo and are administered by the Tokyo metropolitan government. So Koike Yuriko, or whoever wins the governor's race over this weekend, will be in charge of those islands that are there. So again, this Chinese warning and Japanese criticism of China, they're all tied into all these actions that Japan itself has been doing.
All the things you may or may not want to know, you can find out here on Tokyo on Fire. Please continue to stay tuned. We're always talking about interesting topics and things that influence the political process here in Japan. Stay tuned.